Psalm 14 will bring to a conclusion the first mini group of psalms, those first 14 psalms, bringing us back to the same genre with which we began, that of wisdom. The icon I use for that psalm of wisdom is a tree, just as we had in Psalm 1, reminding us that wisdom is ultimately practical. It's not knowledge, but it is living a good life, a life that, like a tree, is stable, is fruitful, is nourishing to others, and reproduces itself in others. So a tree is a good metaphor, I think, for wisdom. And this particular psalm, even though it is a wisdom psalm, is largely about the fool. Because sometimes we learn what it means to be wise by looking at what its opposite is. We look at the opposite. This is a very frequent technique in Hebrew poetry, is to define something by looking at its opposite. And so this psalm looks at the fool. Very famously begins with the statement, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Might notice that this psalm is parallel to Psalm 53. In fact, they're almost identical with a few variations. This is a wisdom psalm that becomes a prayer by its final verse in verse 7. It consists of two very clear parts. The first part is the description of the fool. The second part is the confidence that the faithful can have. Now, when we use the word fool in the Old Testament, it always has a moral component to it. We're not talking about someone who is lacking in intelligence. You can be super smart and yet do morally evil, wicked things. So understand that when it comes to fool, we're not talking about a simple person, a stupid person, but we're talking about a morally deficient person. And that's rooted in their worldview or their understanding of things. In their heart, they say there is no God. Now, we're not talking here about a philosophical atheist, although that could possibly be there. We're talking more about a practical atheist, someone who lives as if there were no God. It's doubtful in the ancient world that there were philosophical atheists. If they were few and far between. But like today, there were a lot of practical atheists, people living as if there were no God, thinking that there is no consequence, there's no judgment for any of their actions. And so left to that, then they do pretty much whatever they want. They don't seek God, and they turn away from the things of God, and they become corrupt to the point where the psalmist will say, there's none who does good, not even one. Disbelief in God results in the removal of any moral constraints. If there's no judgment, then an individual is free to do whatever they want and accept those consequences. And so this is a description of people who act as if there were no God. The result is they become corrupt, and the word here is used of corrupt fruit, of spoiled fruit rather, so rotten, useless. So sort of the opposite of what a tree produces good fruit. And here we have a tree of foolishness. Disbelief in God results in spoiled fruit. And we see this lived out in their actions in verse 4. This particularly graphic picture, they eat up my people as they eat bread. They consume other people. They treat other people as objects for their gratification. They become, in a sense, cannibals, destroying others for their own purposes. We don't have to look too far to see examples of that in the modern world as well. The psalm will conclude with some confidence for the faithful. They can be confident that while those who deny God and live as if there were no God, what they have in store for them is, in verse 5 there, a great terror. But God is with the generation of the righteous. God is the refuge for the poor in particular. And there is a statement that salvation will come out of Zion. The Lord will restore his fortune, so rejoice and be glad. The word poor in verse 6, I think, links this psalm to the previous psalm, Psalm 10 in particular, and the group of psalms that preceded it, those 5 psalms from 9 to 13. We don't know the occasion for this Psalm of David, but I have a theory, and that has to do with the name Nabal. You might know the story of Nabal and his wife Abigail. David is fleeing from Saul. He seeks refuge in the household of Nabal. And Nabal is ready to kick him out, and his wise wife, Abigail, says, no, my husband is a fool, David. And she takes care of him and his men, and Nabal meets an unpleasant end. But the Hebrew word Nabal means fool. And so I wonder if David had this guy in mind when he wrote this psalm. Can't prove that, but I've always associated those two because the name Nabal means fool. At least that's the nickname that was given to this guy. So that could be the context. Theologically speaking, of course, the psalm reminds us of God's judgment, that God is not distant, separate from this world, but in fact, he is looking down, he is watching, he is judging us, looking to see if there's any who understand and seek him. And he has endowed us with free will, and left to ourselves, we more often than not have chosen ourselves over God and over others, and the result is corruption. The psalm also reminds us that God is with the righteous, that God saves those who trust in him and align their lives with his ways. As far as the editor's perspective on this psalm, I think this psalm comes at the end of the first group of 14 psalms. We've seen this when we took a look at Psalm 8. We saw that Psalm 8 was at the chiastic center of these 14 psalms. And we begin with this pair of Psalms 1 and 2, a wisdom psalm and a royal psalm, although Psalm 2 also contains wisdom and it describes what happens to people who reject God, just as Psalm 1 describes that as well. Then we have 5 psalms of disorientation. So God, if you're good, Psalm 1, Psalm 2, if you're sovereign, if you're all-powerful, then why am I having trouble? So we have 5 laments that are disorienting. Then we come to Psalm 8, Psalm of orientation, that reminds us of these keys, that God is mindful of us, that he has endowed us to reflect his glory, to participate in his work, and given us his identity as made in his image. Then we return to 5 more laments of disorientation, and now this Psalm 14 will sort of cap that off and take us back to where we started, a psalm of wisdom, and shows by example the consequence of foolishness. So this is a pretty clear chiasm with Psalm 8 as the hymnic center. I think Psalms 9 through 14 also show us the world of Psalm 8 turned upside down. Psalm 8 defines for us the purpose of human beings. It is to reflect the image of God and to manage and care for this world and to value human life. And so as we sin, which sin is at its essence a failure of purpose, failure to do what we were designed to do, as we do so, we become less human. We become cannibalistic. We consume one another, as the psalmist said, like bread, and we eat our own. So this psalm kind of caps off what happens when we reject the truth and the orienting nature of Psalm 8. Looking at this through the lens of Christ, I can't help but see in verse 7, the salvation coming for Israel is ultimately salvation that Jesus brings. The salvation from ourselves, the salvation of turning toward God and rejecting the foolishness of resisting him. The psalm also is quoted extensively by Paul in the book of Romans as he makes his case that all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. He quotes the Psalms many times in that particular passage, and here he quotes a pretty big chunk of this to come to his conclusion that we have all sinned and we have fallen short of the glory of God. We've failed in our purpose of reflecting God. This psalm has a lot of personal applications. Here's a couple. One, don't be so quick to judge others. When we read a psalm like this, we're tempted to say, God, I thank you that I'm not like the fool, because I believe in God. I'm not like the fool. And we find ourselves very quickly becoming pharisaical, potentially, by doing this. And this psalm reminds us just by the fact that Paul quotes it in Romans 3 to say that all have sinned. We've all sinned and fallen short of his glory. So be careful that we don't become pharisaical with a psalm like this. And we recognize that we all are in need of God's grace. Secondly, this song is a very sobering reminder that if we live our life denying the reality of God's judgment, of God's looking down from heaven and watching us, then we'll tend to treat people as consumables. We'll tend to ignore their value and their purpose and we'll use them for ourselves. I think a very modern example of this is the use of pornography, where we objectify men and women and use them for our own gratification and really deny their inherent dignity and value as made in the image of God. And we consume them, we use them, we pay for them, and consume them for ourselves. I think this text has a lot to say to us today as it comes to the consequence of living our lives as if there were no God, of thinking that God doesn't see, God doesn't know, God will never judge. We become like the very people that we might be quick to condemn, atheists who reject God. When we indulge our sinful nature in that way, we are no different than the atheist.